Good afternoon, and thank you all for being with us. Our panel is called Practice Makes Almost Perfect, Working with Practitioners in the Field. And our goal today is to really unpack this idea championed by our new president, Tom Bailey, that research cannot be designed or implemented without the input and buy-in of people who have firsthand knowledge, expertise, and experience working in psychology, health, and education, which are often very much interrelated. As you'll be hearing, our faculty speakers are all people who are working very closely with practitioners, both locally and nationally. So I'll just say a little bit about each of them, and you'll find more information about them in your programs. Chuck Bash is the Richard March Ho Professor of Health and Education. Chuck has focused national attention on how health issues such as asthma, teen pregnancy, and violence disproportionately affect low-income and minority students, how those disparities contribute to the nation's education achievement gap, and how schools can and must make improving student health a fundamental part of their mission. Tom Brock is Research Professor and Director of TC's Community College Research Center. He previously served as Commissioner of the National Center for Education Research at the U.S. Department of Education, where he also assumed the duties of the Director of the Institute of Education Sciences. In that role, he increased the center's focus on post-secondary education and encouraged researchers to investigate practical problems facing colleges and students in partnership with post-secondary institutions and college systems. Chris Emden is an Associate Professor of Science Education. He is a pioneer in the use of hip-hop as a culturally relevant and culturally sustaining medium for teaching science. Dr. Emden is the author and editor of several books on urban and science education, including his most recent compilation of essays on hip-hop education. He is the creator of the he's the creator of the hashtag hip-hop-ed, that's really important, social media movement, and the Science Genius Project. And Marie Maville is Professor of Psychology and Education and Chair of Teachers College's Department of Counseling and Clinical Psychology. She directs TC's Winter Roundtable on Cultural Psychology in Education and co-founded the college's bilingual Latino mental health concentration, the only program in New York to offer culturally appropriate training in delivering mental health services in Spanish to Latino clients. So we're all very happy to be here with you today to share some ideas about bringing research and practice together effectively to advance our society so all can flourish. To begin our conversation, I would like to start with a little story which may sound surprising coming from a mathematics educator. But in my own research, I'm finding that storytelling about mathematics experiences can be an effective medium for mathematics learning and also socialization and enhancing teacher practice. So here's an example of what I mean. Some years ago, I was a new teacher at a large public school, and I was teaching geometry. And I was apparently doing a very decent job because one morning I arrived around 7 a.m., and there was a row of 15 or so kids who I had never seen before sitting outside of my classroom. When I asked what they were doing, they reported that our principal had told them to come see me for geometry help. Now, these weren't students in any of my geometry classes, so I was a little confused. Let's just say what happened politely was that the students had expressed some concern about their geometry teacher. They were worried that they weren't getting what they needed in their class with her in order to be successful. So what was the principal's solution? She told the students, well, Miss Walker's here every morning by 7. You can go to her for help. Well, I wasn't going to tell those kids they couldn't come to me. Although you can imagine I did have some questions for the principal. But I did not see how I could individually tutor 15 kids, especially when some of my own students were coming for before-school help. So the quick end to the story is that I put everyone into groups, got organized, got kids who were doing well in geometry from both sets of classes, the ones taught by me and the ones taught by the other teacher, to work together in a kind of peer tutoring model that I created on the fly. Now that peer tutoring program became so popular that every morning before school, my classroom was full of kids doing geometry, which was a beautiful sight to see. So I went to the principal and said, I need a budget for breakfast. I have 30 kids in my room who are missing the free school breakfast because they'd rather stay and do geometry. I'm telling you this story because this peer tutoring program model that I developed as a high school teacher over the years has continued to inspire research directions and ideas for practice in my own work. It influenced in many ways my choice of dissertation topic. It inspired my work here as a postdoctoral fellow at Teachers College, and it continues to inspire me as a faculty member doing research in local schools. I always encourage schools to think about instituting a kind of peer tutoring program for mathematics. The first school I worked with on this here in New York City was surprised at how successful this model could be. And I was able to study the mechanism of just why such a model can be so effective. And that work has eventually led to other research projects and a book on how we can build stronger mathematics learning communities in urban high schools. So this is an example of how a practitioner's work can inspire a researcher's work. It just so happens that in this case, the practitioner was me, and the researcher was me too, the same person. We sometimes think of the relationship between research and practice as being one way, in one direction. And I would like to push back on that a bit with our first question. So I'd like to invite our panelists to reflect on this question, and you should feel free to engage each other on this and subsequent questions. How has your research been informed by the work of practitioners?
I mean, I would say that I would not have a research agenda if there weren't practitioners who were informing what I was thinking about. So the work is always generated by problems of practice that a practitioner articulates and says, well, you know, I'm trying this, it's not quite working, or I was thinking about this and it's working a little bit, can you give me more insight? So at the anchor of any research practice are problems that a practitioner, or successes that a practitioner finds, that you want to either sort of like bring more light to, or you want to be able to replicate, or you want to give more insight to. I think the idea of, you know, when you described the story, right? And you're like, it just so happened that I was the researcher and the practitioner. I think that's exactly it. I think that the idea of the researchers existing outside of the work is the problem. I think those of us who are in this space really helped teachers to reimagine their role as researchers and practitioners, that you cannot be an effective practitioner if you're not a researcher, and we can't be effective researchers if we're not willing to go out there and engage in a practice with you, then the work doesn't get done.
Yeah, I really have to just agree with everything you just said, and both of you. For me, as a Latina, I was really moved by Dr. Carranza's talk this morning, and really talking about especially the importance of family in terms of making sure that kids feel at home in school, and that it's so necessary to engage families. So when we talk about engaging practitioners, we need to make that a larger question even in terms of engaging communities. So when I was thinking about some of these questions for today's panel, I was thinking about not just myself as a researcher, but actually in honor of a school chancellor, myself as a teacher of future researchers. And that is where the nexus of connection between practice and research I have found in working with underserved communities. Because if you can create a pipeline of training, then you can create a conversation between practitioners and us as teachers and researchers of what is it that our students need to learn in terms of effectively practicing with communities that are underserved, but also in terms of what kind of research questions are really going to best serve our communities.
For my part, I work for an applied research center, the Community College Research Center, and the reason we exist is to produce research that will inform practice. But by the same token, everything we do is informed by the field of practice. Take the issue of developmental education, for example. Based on research that CCRC has done and other academics, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that developmental education as conventionally taught is not helpful for students. It doesn't give them the skills they need to succeed in college. We have published that research. It really served as a wake-up call for the field. But the best ideas for how to reform developmental education have come from the field. Right. The issue of co-requisites, for example, the idea that you, rather than placing students in developmental education courses, you put them in standard college level courses, but wrap additional supports around them so that they can succeed in those courses, is an idea that's taking off all around the country. But it's faculty at community colleges and other institutions that have developed that idea. Right. And it's come full circle because now CCRC and other researchers are studying the effectiveness of those models to really understand if it works, how well it works, and for whom it best works.
So Chuck, I wonder if you want to address that question, but also if you would like to talk a little bit about the other direction, how your work has been, or research has been used effectively by practitioners.
Sure, thank you, Erica. First of all, as somebody who's been here for quite a while doing research on randomized trials and observational studies and epidemiological studies, I have to tell you I was really honored to be asked to be on the practice panel. Because I think that's where it's really at for us right now. Any good research study, at the end of the study, is going to raise other questions, but I believe our greatest challenge as researchers and as an institution is to put into practice what we already know.
Absolutely.
And the only way it's going to be possible to do that is by collaborating with practitioners as equal partners. One of the things that I found early on was a lot of programs that were being advocated were not being implemented. And that led to questions, well, why not? Why are they not being implemented? And there are a lot of reasons many programs don't get implemented. But some have to do with the fact that they're unacceptable to the leaders in schools. They're unacceptable to teachers who are responsible for implementations, and the students may not like them. They're not engaged in them. So it's not surprising that there's resistance to implementation. And what I found is the greatest way to increase the chances that programs will not only have a chance of succeeding because they're based on sound evidence, but also that they're feasible to implement and acceptable to the students and those responsible for implementation, is you have to involve those people from the outset to conceptualize and design the approaches. Like you're saying, your example of peer teaching program is a great example. I mean, I bet that benefited the peers every bit as much as it benefited the people they were tutoring. So I've been fortunate that my work is had some application, and I could talk about my early work with dietary behavior in young Latino children, or I could talk about my work with telephone outreach to promote colon cancer screening or diabetic retinopathy screening. But the work I'm most inspired about is really the work I've done on health barriers to learning. And I think this is really important because while the instructional approaches we use is very important, and the effectiveness of teachers is very important, and the accountability metrics we use and the way we structure schools is all very important, all of those important aspects of education are going to have limited effects if the students aren't motivated and ready to learn. And there are certain health problems that have powerful but largely overlooked effects on students' motivation and ability to learn. So I think people in schools, leaders in schools, teachers in schools realize that, and they're prepared, they want assistance in addressing those needs, but we have to acknowledge that right now the structures are not in place in schools to take that on. They need help. And I don't want to jump ahead too much, but I think we here at Teachers College are in a really unique position to be able to show what's possible if we can break down the silos between education and health and social services to work together and work beyond just the college with other partners and stakeholders in the city to demonstrate what can be done here.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
You know what's interesting about that, if I may, because you say you're going to have a dialogue. So. Yeah. But I think if you're looking at the points that Marie made and the points that you made, Chuck, what I really find intriguing about the idea of like focusing on community or looking at what's happening in the spaces is the variable that always exists in research that we oftentimes don't consider, right? And I think that variable is always context. So when you're constructing a research idea or an approach, it's often done in this sort of idealized scenario. So if I do this, then this will happen, and then I will take that and give it to people, and then they'll do it, and then it'll work. But that does not at all consider the nuances of context. So like, what I found most fascinating in my work with practitioners is that I've come up with what I think is an amazing idea, right? I'm like, oh, we're gonna do reality pedagogy, it's gonna be great. And because it worked out well in the sample school in the Bronx. And then I go to Brooklyn and it doesn't. And so even within the space that is perceived to have similar demographics and similar communities, there's some nuance contextually in the city, not to talk about nationally or internationally. And what the practitioners do is they give us insight into the nuances of context to help us to be able to construct research ideas or theories that are nuanced, that are not sanitized. And without communities, right, we don't have information about context. And without context, we have empty research because it's only constructed for scenarios that don't at all reflect reality.
And just to, sorry, build on just
No,
for one more moment.
necessary.
Take an idea like, 20% of kindergarten students in New York City public schools and Title I schools need eyeglasses. I mean, think about that. Well, that sounds like an easy problem, so we worked with the health department and we screened kids and we did the exams right on the spot and we provided them glasses, one pair for school, one pair to take home. But then you have to realize, well, some of the kids don't want to wear the glasses. And why is that? How are you going to deal with that?
Because they're not
and how are you going
flawed.
to provide the social reference? And then what are you going to do? Do you have a system in place to help the teachers understand whether the kids need the glasses for near work, far work, both? And then what's going to happen when the child loses the glasses? Are you going to know when they lose the glasses? How long is it going to take to replace the glasses? So that's where...
How do the glasses look?
How do
Which
the
is also like...
glasses look? Yes, yes. So that's why you can't succeed without that, collaboration.
Right. We've already started talking a little bit about our own research practice partnerships, but I wonder if Marie or Tom would like to expand maybe on the types of research practice partnerships you've engaged in over the course of your career. Maybe you can choose one or two and tell us about what made those effective.
Sure. So again, I want to talk about the third arm of what we do as academics, which is teaching. So the two specific projects that I have engaged in that have melded practice and research have involved bridge programs that brought our students into communities to learn not only how to practice, but then how to shape research questions and actually how to develop dissertation projects based on that work. So before I was here, I was in Oklahoma and was very honored to have participated in a bridge program called American Indians into Psychology. The whole program was about socializing, energizing, just bringing the face of the academy into the world of indigenous peoples. Oklahoma's, one of the top states that has Native American people. And so the whole process, it was such a learning thing. As Chris is saying, sometimes we're trained as this is the way research is going to look. But when you're working with communities that have been long underserved or ignored or even worse, exploited for research purposes, there is no protocol. We're actually sometimes, as you did, flying by the seat of our pants. And so even what it's like to reach out to different tribes, different nations, go to the headquarters, go to powwows, go to sweat lodges, become immersed into that community, to get to know the elders, to get to know who are the respected leaders, as well as who are the practitioners there, because there is oftentimes for a lot of underrepresented communities a link between community leaders and practitioners. And so what we did was to have both summer programs that brought undergraduate psychology students from all around the country, Native American, to work for 6 weeks in a tribal headquarters, which a lot of these kids had never done, as well as fund doctoral students to then also have both practicum placements, which is training as a psychologist, and then engage in research. And so, that program has been around now 15 years, and I can't even tell you, we're in the hundreds in terms of educating Native American students, which is one of the lowest achieving group in terms of education, not because of the wish or the will, but because of the lack of access. Oh. And then here in New York City, I've been very honored to work with Dr. Carranza's boss's wife, First Lady Charlene McRae, in a bridge program, in a community health building program, where we reached out to a community-based organization that had a lot of different services, legal services, career services, but they had no mental health services. So what we did was to train the staff members at that. We bridged with a institution, a CBO in northern Manhattan, and began to train that staff on what mental health services looks like. So we also were able to bring in bilingual students, and because this is a catchment area which is like 70% Latino. And so at this point, we now have multiple practicum students working there. We have a doctoral student working there talking about looking at a dissertation project of how to reach out to community, and to work in that community. So by learning to be a practitioner, at the same time, you also learn to be a researcher. And you learn to hear from that community what the needs are, rather than us coming in and imposing things.
Oh.
I really want to underscore that last point. I think coming in as a researcher, not to impose, but to listen,
Yes.
is probably the first and most important objective to making this work and to make it meaningful. You know, I had a bit different experience and perspective on researcher-practitioner partnerships from my prior job at the Institute of Education Sciences. We had a grant program specifically to support researcher-practitioner partnerships. And the fundamental idea behind these grants was, first off, that they be focused on problems or issues that the practitioners identified as important. And you had to document that fact, that this was their question, their concern, not something that the researcher generated. A second piece of these grants was that it actually required a co-principal investigator model in which the co-PI was not another researcher, but someone from the education agency or the program. So you had this mutuality, this kind of equal structure, equal leadership structure that was important there. And then the third piece was that the practitioners and the researchers would work together in all phases of the research. So not only, you know, designing at the front end, but really thinking about how the research itself was carried out and conducted, thinking about appropriate roles for the practitioners as well as the researchers in doing data collection, in doing analysis, and doing dissemination. Particularly the dissemination piece, I think one thing we learned is that practitioners are the best disseminators in the world. They are so much more persuasive and convincing when they get on a stage to talk about the work and how it made a difference in their schools than even the best lecturer or professor that I've encountered. So those are just some key lessons. Maybe just a last thing I would point out from our work. Over the course of the years I was at IES, we funded a little more than 80 of these researcher-practitioner partnerships. They were all over the country. They were at all levels of education, from pre-K all the way up through adult and post-secondary. We did find that these partnerships take time to take hold. It's a matter of time to build trust. It's a matter of time to figure out really who should be involved. Sometimes the most senior person, for instance, from an education agency really is not the most suitable because they don't have the time to commit. So really kind of figuring out who the right players are is key. That matter of trust, kind of working together over time. We often found that the work really was developmental in nature. And so many times the most effective partnerships started with just trying to understand a problem or an issue. It was very descriptive or exploratory in nature. Sometimes then that would lead to development of new ideas, and that would lead to new kinds of research methods, to iteratively pilot test, for instance, an intervention. And then perhaps in the long run, it might lead to more of an evaluation of a program to see if in fact it was making the kind of difference that was hoped for. But again, this all takes time and it's a continuum. Rarely did we see these partnerships form where they were ready to jump into the randomized control trial right off.
That's right. Yeah, and especially if these are communities that have been exploited or have never really had their faces represented around the table of a research project, I think those initial conversations make or break the process. And so years in development is not at all uncommon because you have to be there, you have to be present, you have to be somebody, and your group of students or your team has to be a group of people that's trusted and respected first before you say, how can we help? Because a lot of times, for years, right, how can we help is, how can we impose our thoughts on yours? And so true community work, true research that's based with practitioners is based in community values, community norms and community behaviors. So I think practitioners oftentimes are the voice of the people in a way that researchers in our academic world are not, and can actually introduce us to community members that are extremely powerful and just raw and honest about what works, what doesn't work. Even the language of what we call a group therapy, the kids love support group. That's, to listen and use language that reflects the community, and practitioners are oftentimes the people that know that the best, better than us. And if we're lucky enough to come from that community, yes, then that is a years in progress kind of work that can be really valuable.
I love that. Yeah. I always tell my students that, every program or initiative is not necessarily research ready.
Yes.
And I think we come from a world where there are these pressures to be able to produce an outcome research-wise really quickly.
Yeah.
And when you do so, you don't have the opportunity to build those connections. So I do a program called Science Genius. I've been doing it for 8 years now. And I've heard from everyone, well, where's the article? And I'm like, well, for me to be able to do really good work, it requires me being thoughtful in my connections with the community, to have their support for my work, and not just the practitioners, but the students who are part of the project.
Yeah.
And so, I'm not gonna do fast food research when we need soul food. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right.
Like fast food, I can go in there, I can press the buttons and churn something out. Yeah. This requires Thanksgiving dinner work.
Yeah.
So, and everybody's gotta be on deck. And so, more soul food research. And that allows you to be able to get that investment.
Love it.
I wonder if there are other important lessons that you learned about engaging in research practice partnerships. Tom talked a little bit about how it takes time. You have to be patient. I think that's what you're saying also, Chris. And Marie talked about building that trust and respect over time. Are there other lessons that we should be aware of as we seek to conduct these partnerships?
Yeah, to me, what we're talking about really is trying to, if we're talking about an equity agenda, we're trying to make a difference in people's lives. And in a lot of ways, the most important thing in that agenda is our political will. And it's our commitment to that goal. And if we have a commitment to that goal, we know that people have been talking about that for decades and for generations. And there's a lot of examples where we haven't made as much progress as we need to have made. And we should reflect on why that is and how we can change that. So, that's my hope and dream for Teachers College and for our work here, that we embrace that agenda, that we have that political will and leadership, and that we realize that this is not going to be easy. If it was easy, it would have already been done.
Facts.
And that we may try and fail, and we may try again and fail again. But as long as we are the place where we are trying, where we are sincere and genuine in our commitment, and we continue to learn from our errors and continue to pursue the goals, this will be the place where students want to come. This will be the place that donors want to invest in. This will be the place where faculty will want to work. So for me, the lesson really lies in whether this is our work or this is our life. And I think that's what it's, that's the lesson I've learned from the people who I find most inspiration from, is this is what they've devoted their life. This is their life's work. So it's really the process rather than the short-term outcomes that may be achieved, because I think, as Chris said, we're unrealistic in many cases about the amount of time or money it's going to take to move the needle. And you know, think of it as a parent. I mean, I have 6 children. And I think of all the things that I've done for my own children and every advantage they have had and how they screw up. And you don't give up on them.
That's right.
You give them another chance, and they screw up again. And I think that's the kind of commitment that we need to do something different.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. I love give them another chance. I also love the idea of giving yourself another chance.
Yeah.
I think this idea of, everything that you do doesn't have to be perfect. And everything that everything that you're idealized to be doesn't have to be always there. That we are all, one of my favorite words from the late Maxine Greene, who's like one of my favorite people ever, but this idea of like we're always becoming. And so give yourself the grace to become, right?
Yes.
And I think for me, the gold star for my work that I found in working with a practitioner is be willing to do everything you suggest or recommend, right? So if you're gonna say, hey, I suggest you try X, Y, Z, all right, come in here and do it with me. And if you're not willing to do that, then just keep your mouth quiet.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about the students of color that I've been honored to mentor in the last 20 plus years, almost every single student of color I've mentored is a first generation of some kind. First to college, first to graduate school, all that. And so I've always emphasized exactly what you guys have talked about. And, I know the mood is politically right now, we've talked a lot about resistance. So it's the twin thing of resist that given message that a lot of times diminishes many of us, and persist to follow your dream, follow your bliss. And so those are the two things that I always emphasize with my students, especially, they're in professions that are unfamiliar to them. They're doing research and practice using language that they've not been raised with. So normalizing that, hearing what the feedback is, and actually that changes our practice, that changes our research. And in the same way we listen to our students, we have to listen to our practitioners and to our community members, because it's all of that that creates the most effective and ultimately successful outcomes for any kind of research.
So once you conduct a research project and say you publish the results, could you give an example, or you disseminate the results at a conference or something like that? Could you give an example of when and how that research has been taken up effectively by practitioners in the field? So beyond the research project, so you've done that, and now it's sort of out there, and then you can maybe tell us an example of how it was used in the field effectively.
I have one example. It's not my personal work, but actually Tom Bailey and colleagues at CCRC before I came here published a book called Redesigning America's Community Colleges. I'm sure you've all heard of that particular title. But this was a book that really tried to synthesize some 20 years of research on community colleges and to better understand what was and was not working to serve students, to help them get through programs of study, to earn degrees, to move into employment. And I think the real genius of that book was it wasn't a particular prescription. It wasn't a curriculum that colleges then should just take off the shelf and implement in their colleges and everything would be perfect. Rather, it was a set of principles, really 4 guiding principles that were fairly broad in nature that community colleges themselves had to take to their home campuses, think about what those principles meant for them, for the particular practices they needed to change to create these guided pathways for students from initial entry through completion. And it really opened up dialogue. And that fundamentally, I think, is what made that book so powerful, because people at community colleges took it, they understood it, they made it their own, and it was actionable for them. I think of so many other failures, if you will, within the field of education sciences. The What Works Clearinghouse is filled with studies of interventions that were, technically designed, in a very strong way. They have convincing findings, but nothing happens to that work because it's too much the take it off the shelf model. And that's not how practitioners change their thoughts. It's not how they change their practice.
I think my work, the work that I've been most proud of is around a reality pedagogy, and not like reality pedagogy as like an approach to instruction as this nouveau thing, but what I was very deliberate about in that work is making more concrete, decades of research around cultural relevance and cultural sustaining pedagogies and student-centered pedagogies, these consistent reiterations of the same construct. And what I try to do with that approach is to have these these 7 C's that you can give to teachers that takes the work philosophically into practice. So so cogenerative dialogues, providing a protocol for teachers to be able to engage in conversations with young people, for young people to inform the teacher's practice. This like inbuilt professional development with young people. Co-teaching, providing opportunities for young folks to design and implement teaching, a la what you did. And I think this is magical, right? So I think when Eric was talking about the work that came organically from what you did, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, I construct research out of this. There's another teacher across the country who's like, wait a minute, I've created something here. But they never talk to each other. And the job of the researcher is to identify, oh my gosh, that thing she did, and that thing that person did, utilize my platform, utilize these venues to be able to construct a protocol I can hand to someone and they can implement. So I mean, the C's of reality pedagogy for me, I've seen teachers just say, oh my gosh, I'm doing reality pedagogy. No, you're doing stuff that other folks came up with a billion times over in a more genius way, but you're just implementing a protocol to allow you to do it in the classroom every day. And that practice, I think, is what I'm most proud of. And I've been able, teachers be like, oh, Dr. Emden, I'm a reality pedagogue. I'm like, I should get a t-shirt, but it's really someone who's proud of the fact that they now have a method or an approach to implement what we in the research world have identified as good practice.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think people might be curious about the other 5.
Oh, okay, so there's cogenerative dialogues, the dialogues with young people, the co-teaching, which is giving young folks the opportunity to teach. It's cosmopolitanism, which is these strategies for creating classroom community, like classroom handshakes and names and et cetera. There's context, which is utilizing the community information as the anchor of the examples the teachers use in the classroom. Then content comes after all that stuff. Let me say that again. Then content, which comes after all that stuff, is sort of being deliberate about what you as an educator know and don't know, because oftentimes you find teachers make things up because they just don't know. Competition, so creating like a seedbed for healthy competition and strategies for doing that. And then finally, curation, helping teachers to be able to curate their practice, record their own work, and then study their own practice consistently, and then use that to be able to inform their work. Yeah.
Any other examples of how practitioners have taken up findings from your research?
I guess the work I'm most proud of is related to health in schools, and this has been around for a long time, but it's never really been fully embraced by people in schools. It's always been kind of something that's been done on Friday afternoons, or there's no regents exam, and a lot of times there's no certified teachers in place. And what I've tried to do is show how these specific kinds of health issues directly affect educational outcomes by showing the causal pathways. And the causal pathways include things like, kids' thinking ability, their ability to remember things, their ability to pay attention. For example, if you're sleep deprived because you have poorly controlled asthma, that interferes with your ability to consolidate memories. If you're missing 1 or more days of school a month, as 10% of Latino high school students in America do, because they're afraid to be at school or travel to or from school, that they're missing important learning opportunities. If you don't want to go to school because you don't feel like you belong there, because you don't feel the other students in the school or the adults at the school care about you as a person, and you don't feel that sense of connectedness, that's going to undermine the teacher's hard work to implement good quality programs. So I think by showing the connections between health factors in cognition, school connectedness, and attendance has resonated with educators and helped them appreciate why, unless they address these factors, and they need help in addressing these factors, is going to undermine their other efforts.
What opportunities do you all see currently emerging or re-emerging at TC for enhanced and effective research practice partnerships?
I think your work, like the work with the grant that you guys have around storytelling, this is an age-old tradition, you know, for folks of color. Like, you know, the narrative of the griot historically, you know, when folks were not allowed to read or write by law, you know, there was an amazing storyteller that was able to serve as a teacher. And that's something that's existed before the idea of formal education. And for you now in a contemporary to take that up as a research project and you know, create the sort of math story narrative, you're pulling forth these historical traditions that existed from beforehand. I think that's like what I've found most fascinating about my colleagues here is that kind of creativity and innovation. I'm like, man, spirituality and education, really? Y'all gonna do that? Okay. How are you gonna do it? You know, and people are willing to be creative and willing to be laughed at a little bit, you know? And no, listen, when I first said hip hop and science, they looked at me like I was out of my mind, right? But I think not just me, like our colleagues here have been very willing to take risks, and in their research. And I think that's the beauty of this space, is that I think that the reputation of the institution and the caliber of the scholars allows them the freedom and flexibility to be able to engage in research. They may not necessarily be popular, that may not necessarily be the trend. I'm repping right now. Like, we don't really follow trends, we set them, right? We push the boundaries and we say, okay, come with us. And I think that's been a part of the tradition of the institution historically, and it's certainly alive and well in the contemporary.
Right. Now, I want everyone to know that I did not pay Chris to say that about this project I have, but I had not quite thought about it in that way. As a mathematics education researcher, my work has taken a kind of historical turn, which I find very interesting, and I have interviewed lots of mathematicians who are African American in the United States, who ranged in age from 30 to 90. And so they had really great stories about their formative educational and professional mathematics experiences. So while I was interviewing these people, I would constantly be thinking about, oh, what a great story. I feel like a high school kid should hear that story. Or a teacher could hear this story and do something with this example of great pedagogy. And so the project that I've been developing with Amy Stewart Wells, who's a colleague in the Sociology and Education program, is around STEM storytelling. And what we're trying to do with this project that's been funded by the NSF is to use STEM stories to bridge school communities. And we're starting with elementary school because I think that elementary teachers who are very creative pedagogues in lots of subject areas, but not so much in math and not so much in science.
That's
and
right.
so I think using STEM stories to motivate learning and innovative teaching practices is an interesting way, and I had not quite thought about it in that term, so thank you. Any other opportunities you see here at TC that are sort of emerging or re-emerging, even past projects that we might resuscitate for enhanced and effective research practice partnerships?
Yeah, I would say that's the $64,000 question for me. It really is. I mean, when Grace Dodge and Nicholas Murray Butler founded the school, they did it to prepare the next generation of workforce to serve the poor immigrant children in New York City. And that need is as alive today as it's ever been. And of course, I've always been really honored to be a professor at Teachers College. There's incredible work going on here. People are doing it in all different pockets around the college. People are more known nationally and globally than they are across the hall here at Teachers College. And I think the exciting part about the future for me is to think about what would be possible if we begin to break down the silos and really collectively, as an institution, commit to some goals locally, not nationally, locally, and show what's possible for a college of education to achieve and serve as a model for other schools in that regard.
High five.
Yeah.
I like that.
I would just build on that. I happen to be aware of some conversations already taking place here at Teachers College to build partnerships with New York City, New York State to begin integrating data sets across various systems to really understand the flow of students' lives from early childhood all the way through adulthood, to identify factors that might predict better outcomes for individuals, to answer a whole new set of research questions about what happens to people, for instance, after they leave our education systems, thinking beyond just employment and earnings, which of course matter a lot, but what happens even in terms of the quality of people's lives, their ability to move into the kinds of neighborhoods where they want to live, to form households, to start their own families, to participate in civic life. There's so many opportunities with the large data sets we have now to begin answering those questions, and again, think more about the role of education at the front end to prepare the kinds of students to enter the world we want to have.
That's right. Brilliant.
I'm also thinking of, we live in a digital age now, and social media is a platform, even for pushing forth ideas, for making our research available to people. And so, because I think one of the things we get lost in is we have our conversations, how are we sharing it with the world beyond us? So I definitely think looking at digital approaches to collaborations is not only effective at reaching, of course, younger generations, but also it's a lot cheaper. And so we can get to a lot more people with inexpensive to even free sorts of modes. And so I think that's actually a possibility too. And it's not necessarily something at odds with social justice advocacy.
That's right.
As a matter of fact, social media, the revolution will be heard on, it won't be televised, but it'll be heard on social media.
Speaking of which, hashtag hip hop ahead. So the chief mechanism for our distribution of the research that we do around hip hop and education has been a Twitter chat that I started 7 years ago. And it was lonely, it was like me tweeting into nowhere. But has since become this place where educators from across the country, so teachers, parents, high school students, and professors are on Twitter every Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, talking about the intersections of hip hop and education, hearing research from right away and how it affects practice. And I think the point you made about us being more deliberate and intentional and reimagining how social media is used as a mechanism, not just for distributing research, but also for constructing research. Right? Like, my most recent work around like digital ethnographies with folks who are convening on Twitter has been really, really powerful. I think we definitely could do a better job utilizing those platforms.
I
How
think
do we
some of
get the
that,
media to talk about your Twitter feed as opposed to the tweets of some other influential?
I shall not
American?
comment on that one, sir. Great point.
I'm sorry.
no, that's okay. I think some of our colleagues in the Communication, Media, Learning, and Technology Design program in our department are doing this work around digital ethnography and looking at Twitter as a medium for research. So I think that's a collaboration with our own department that we should really work on, looking at the vice chair there. I think we have time for a couple of questions from the audience, if we would like to do that. Any questions? Oh, let me just say, now, I was a high school teacher, so that means that your question should be a question, and let's try to keep them, somewhat brief. Thank you.
Hearing about the 6 children, whatever.
Thank you.
The strategy that you would present to those who are in the field or career educators would be different than for those who are not. And there are children who just don't like school. How would you bring this type of excitement to them? Take and doing, it's a continuum. But you have to really like it, to embrace it, to be able to sit here and hear with excitement the energy that you bring. And listening to your stories, and I'm going to walk
I actually, this is a real life story that I will try to keep short. This is, I'm an aunt, and I am a very good aunt. And my nephew, my youngest nephew, came home from school when I was visiting Atlanta, where I'm from, and announced he hated math, he was done with it. And my sister said, who also doesn't like math either, I don't think she would mind me sharing that with everyone, said, oh, you've got to talk to your auntie. So I said, what's going on with this hate of math? What? And he was just completely, something had happened at school, some concept that he didn't understand. And so we engaged in play around mathematics. We used Monopoly money. That's too long a story, but suffice it to say, he now understood place value. He now understood how to add and subtract 3-digit numbers that involve regrouping. And my sister was documenting all of this, and so I was just doing it, and she said, you really need to write this down and take some pictures so you can share it with classroom teachers. She said, because I'm not sure I understood exactly why we did these things, but when you brought out that Monopoly money and did those things. So I think the ways in which we engage with practitioners and give examples, particularly for mathematics, which is unfortunately not often a scene of joy in classrooms. I really am working with elementary and high school teachers to remind them that we want to create lifelong learners, people who are interested in learning for learning's sake, and that mathematics is part of that. And so we think about ways to make mathematics joyful, engaging, interesting, and we do that together. We build it together in professional development sessions and things like that. So I think stories are a good medium to do this, and so the more stories we can embed in professional development and our work with teachers, the better.
Yeah, Chancellor Carranza earlier today was emphasizing from an audience question, the importance of fun in learning, that learning is fun, and it can be fun. It's challenging. It's as much emotional as it is cognitive. And to be able to access the heart as well as the mind, I have found that's where the moments happen. That's where the learning, that's where, in psychology, that's where the insights can happen, is dealing with that scary uncertainty of the moment, of what people are thinking and feeling in the moment, and hear it, and be able to respond to it. I'm talking about, in therapy and those things. That's what draws people in. I was saying to a student earlier today about dancing on the precipice of risk. When you're truly open and listening to what somebody's trying to tell you, you're quiet, you're listening. So that's, I think, the energy teachers, practitioners, researchers, all we must bring to the table is our ability to hear, not to chat, right? And I think that, we believe in people's natural energies to find joy. So we feel the joy, and our ability to access the other person's joy. I think that's what builds that motivation.
Dancing on the precipice of risk. That's so beautiful. That's so I mean, my answer, really, if there's a short answer to this, is you have to research the places where joy exists outside of school, and that should be where the models are drawn from, right? So, for me, it's not really about the really crazy intellectual exercise. I'm like, okay, school's corny. Kids don't like it. It's boring. Where are they super excited? When they're in rap ciphers. Okay, let's construct a rap cipher-based pedagogy. It's got to be sometimes we just make it too complicated. Look at young folks in their own element, and glean the research ideas from where they're expressing that joy and their connections to everything and anything. The work of the really powerful educator and researcher is to draw the connections between the organic expressions of joy and what's happening around content.
Okay. Well, I think, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time, but we're all going to be at this wonderful reception. So I want to thank all of our panelists, Chris, Chuck, Tom, Marie, and I want to thank you all for coming. The reception is going to be in the Smith Learning Theater, which is in the library, the Russell Building, on the 4th floor, and there's staff on hand to direct you. And we look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow at the investiture ceremony. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. Good job, as always.